Okay, so in part two of the lecture, we're going to look at some sociological themes. I'm going to reiterate some of the things I've discussed already and go into some actual sociological themes more deeply. So, in terms of how sociology functions and is performed, we draw on kind of a bunch of different traditions that permeate throughout the research that we do and the motivations that we have for doing things, and then the way that we want to kind of intervene in the world. So you'll see throughout the course in particular is really teaching a lot of sociological theories and concepts. In terms of engendering a sociological gaze, we want you to have exposure to a wide range of sociological perspectives and different critical conceptual ways of thinking about the world to make that, to do that thing of making the normal look strange. So we were doing that in terms of also drawing out of the critical tradition. Criticism in that sense is very important to develop better policy, to reform things that aren't working that well, to try and be more inclusive. And so theories are quite useful for having that kind of critical point of view on the way current things are, the way things are. Mitch will be going into the theory aspect of things in much more detail in week 2. The way the sociologists try and do these things is through their research. So research is an important thing to do just in and of itself. Production of new knowledge is always important. Understanding more and more aspects of society is important. But obviously understanding how things work, understanding how society works, understanding, say, how a particular policy in school or at work is functioning or not, is essential to be able to create better policy and with the idea of making things better. Now, unfortunately, that's not how things tend to work. There's so much really amazing research about all aspects of day-to-day life, but in terms of the political implementation of these things, certainly doesn't run very smoothly. Research about stuff is often very much ignored in the political realm that's about kind of short-term kind of symbolic gains and stuff like that. But that doesn't stop us from trying, and you'll see that there's a lot of sociologists in Australia in particular that are quite vocal about their research, are tabling things in Parliament, are going on the media and things like that we'll talk about through the lens of public sociology later. I've discussed already the notion of structure and agency that's kind of at the heart of that gaze. Structure here pertains to cultural, social institutions, inequalities, norms that constrain what we can do and who we can be. Structures kind of, in the way it kind of relates to agency here, is particularly relevant to the notion of life chances, a term coined by Max Weber. And it's the way that kind of people, born into different parts of the world, whether it's kind of more economically challenged or from particular racial and ethnic backgrounds or being male and female, these structures have real implications on one's life chances. That is the agency to put your kind of choices into practice to be able to do the things you want to do. So we all kind of think, more often than not, we kind of are making our choices in our day-to-day lives from an independent, individual point of view. But sociologists kind of challenge that norm and kind of point out that we're never really entirely able to put our kind of choices into action, without the consideration of other things, without the consideration of other people, without the influence of institutions and histories and traditions and all kinds of things. So very broadly here, we all make our own decisions about how we live and how things we want to do, that kind of agency, but we do not make those decisions entirely free of social constraints and influences, and that's kind of a more structural element. So there's constant debates and tensions in sociology about the structure-agency kind of relationship, very much under that kind of understanding of or question of how free we are to act. So, you can think about this in terms of education systems. As a kid at kindergarten, when you were that 5-year-old, you didn't have a lot of choice about what school you went to. Your parents did. But really then your parents probably didn't have a huge amount of choice either. There was probably rules about, you had to go in a particular area, and then within that area, did you have an array of schools you could choose from, and was there public and private schools, and could your parents actually afford to send you to a private school? in more global things, people are moving around the world all the time now and going to universities in different countries. No doubt people studying in this course are doing that at the moment. But really, access to those elite institutions is really restricted to a very kind of rich and privileged few. So even sometimes if you have the money, even if you get an entrance marks, if you don't have the money, if you don't have the freedom to be mobile, if you don't have responsibilities, for instance, you might have responsibilities of looking after parents or brothers and sisters and stuff like that. You need to be able to kind of have quite a bit of privilege to be able to put that agency into place. So this tension tends to kind of have voluntarism on the one world. This is a kind of philosophical understanding that we kind of do whatever you want. And then more structural determinism on the other side, where we're kind of, determined from birth into kind of situations and socialized into particular roles, and therefore we don't have any agency. Most sociologists are somewhere in the middle, I would say, and kind of take into account both sides of these things. So it's rare you'll find in this course that, there'll be a completely voluntaristic or a structurally determinist position. Most of the concepts we're teaching are somewhere that kind of bring in both structure and agency into understandings of the world. So very broadly, the understanding of how individuals or groups perform their lives, make their identities, make their choices, try and be who they want to be, operates within social structures. Now, importantly, as I said before, social structures can be also quite enabling. They allow us to have various kind of roles or understandings between each other about how to live, kind of almost like, scripts that we'll talk about later on in the course as well. So they can be freeing in that sense, in the sense that should protect us from violence. Social structures such as education systems can, help us learn more about the world. The government can provide welfare states that can kind of help people that are kind of disadvantaged or are out of work to be able to get by until they get jobs. So there's kind of enabling aspects of those things. But in terms of those same structures as well, there's often constraining things. Increasingly, our welfare state is more pernicious, harder to access, more bureaucratic, takes up more and more of your time, to the point where many sociologists point out that it's kind of almost like a full-time job now to access unemployment benefits sometimes. Schools both, teach us about the world, but also discipline us, teach particular things in particular ways, and you can see the way that there's debates about what the curricula should be, are good reflections of that. So again, these kind of social structures set up the way things are now, and changing social structures and institutions can have real effects on the way things can change in the future. So, while we are born into a world not of our own making, we're not passive puppets. We can imagine alternative futures, and we can kind of engage with social structures and try and change them. Okay, so in terms of sociology as well, there's kind of key sociological themes, and we'll do kind of whole weeks in the course on some of these, and then power is a more general one that kind of we look at throughout the course. Class is a key sociological theme, how our economic position in society affects our opportunities and life chances. The school you attended to, how it affects your opportunities. In Australia in particular, the divide between private and public is particularly stark, and the immense amount of government funding that goes into private now is increasingly criticised from the sociology of education in terms of the stark inequalities that this produces. Another aspect of class is the occupation, how the job you do may reflect socialisation, various forms of inequalities, and how particularly jobs relate to status. Something, for instance, like white-collar work tends to be kind of seen as higher status than blue-collar work, even though from a critical point of view, you would question the value of a lot of that kind of stuff, whether white-collar work is necessarily better for society than blue-collar work. There's many kind of white-collar jobs that seem to be kind of just more destructive to people's lives, something like the, commercial law and all this kind of stuff that creates all kinds of inequalities and problems of access, and tends to favour those who already own property and that kind of thing. So we can think about something like the institution of the law through this class lens, and you've probably all heard the famous quip about how property is 9/10 of the law. We'll look at that from a critical perspective later in the course. Class also relates to things like taste, Things like good and bad taste aren't just kind of some, evaluated in a vacuum thing that kind of has some objective understanding of what is good and bad. We'll see that things like morals, things like taste in music and taste in art and all that kind of stuff tend to relate to the tastes of people with lots of cultural capital, lots of education, who get to define those things more than those that don't. So in that sense, our class backgrounds have fundamental effects on our life chances, our values, our opinions, and this has been a key sociological theme throughout the last couple of centuries. Most recently, the rise of data, big data, algorithms, platform capitalism has kind of produced another layer of class on top of the kind of more material notions of work and economic background and stuff. Our data today is collected by these companies and used in all kinds of ways that we often don't know about or understand, but increasingly is used to make decisions about, say, who gets access to a rental, or who will get life insurance or medical insurance or house insurance. Again, we'll look at aspects of that later in the course as well. A second key sociological theme is gender, and we'll look at this through the lens of biology and culture, or the nature-nurture debate in particular. So this is the sense of how much is like the kind of social roles we play, or are sometimes forced to play, when you're born as a male or female, whether that reflects actual kind of sex differences, or how much of that is actually kind of culture and ideology. There's no real reason, for instance, we tend to put boy babies in blue and girl babies in pink. There's no real reason that Tonka trucks, kind of those kind of things should be given to boys more than and Barbie dolls to girls. This is definitely cultural aspects that relates to the gendered natures of masculinity and femininity. At a more kind of material level, women are still paid less for doing the same work. Despite the kind of rise in feminism, women are still also doing more of the housework and looking after the kids, and increasingly going out into the labour market as well. So there's increased pressure on women to be able to do everything. And we can see this, how it reflects in kind of labour market inequalities as well. Things like casualisation tend to affect women more so than men. We'll also look at sexualities in relation to sex and gender. It's important to make sure we keep a strong definition or difference between sex and sexualities that we'll look at in some detail later on in the course. And particularly the way the kind of different sexualities have been defined as normal or deviant in long histories of the persecution and marginalisation of gay identities, for instance, and the way that those kind of labels are applied to people, and then the way those people use those labels to politically organise their own emancipation. So gender, and again, a fundamental sociological theme. Another one is race and ethnicity. I've kind of discussed some of these examples already. There's the kind of one about looting that I talked about in part one. There's kind of notions of cultural appropriation, the kind of hipster wearing of headwear from different kind of indigenous societies that was a kind of thing of debate a couple of years ago. There's a representation of kind of what's often male violence, where like a brown person is seen as a terrorist, a black person is seen as a thug and in a ghetto or whatever, and when it's a white person that commits a mass shooting, there's all kinds of complexities that are often reported around it rather than just kind of the stereotypes. So we'll look at the kind of conceptual underpinnings of this in some detail throughout the course. Firstly, the very notion of whether race actually scientifically exists, which has been fundamentally critiqued throughout the last century, but still notions of racism persist. There's often kind of more genetic and DNA differences within what we call particular races than between them, yet race still seems to be a key category of discrimination and identity. We'll look at different forms of racism, from the scientific to cultural racism, different particularly racialized social problems around things like migration and refugees, and we'll do kind of a whole week thinking about colonialism and the place of Indigenous Australians. You'll see here that mostly I've focused here on the kind of those that are discriminated against or marginalised, but really when it comes to race and ethnicity as well, it's important to kind of critically analyse the dominant group, and like there's an increasingly important study around whiteness, the cultural aspects of that. You can think about this in terms of what it means to be an Australian and the very different kind of cultural notions of what that means. Is it like, blonde and Aussie and on the beach, or is it like in the outback and all this kind of stuff? There's kind of different versions of that. When that's very confusing, it's very hard for people to then live up to those standards. And this then obviously has effects on, people that come here and are kind of told to assimilate. Race and ethnicity is particularly important for thinking about globalization, that we'll look at in a whole week as well. So, race, ethnicity, gender and class are key contours of inequality that are definitely important sociological themes. And another more broader one that kind of encompasses all of those in a way, and kind of also a way of thinking about institutions and traditions and stuff like that as well, is the notion of power. Who has power and who doesn't? Is power something that can be personified? Is it something you can actually possess? When is the use of power legitimate? Is power top-down or is it everywhere? And there's different conceptual ways we'll be looking at that throughout the course. Do individuals have power? Is it more a kind of group phenomenon? Does money equal power? Does knowledge equal power? Does being a white male equal power? We'll look at kind of these questions in different ways throughout the course. Power in particular in today's contemporary global capitalism can be seen as largely being privatised. Many of the huge companies in the world now have kind of capital as much as middle-sized companies. You can see more recently the kind of rise of white male tech bros moving into the White House in the hallways of kind of governmental power in ways that the private sphere has never been before. So sometimes the separations of these powers is blurry, and there's versions of that happen throughout history, and at the moment we're living in a particular kind of it. You can see here also when it kind of thinking about notions of time and things like climate change, our orientation towards fixing the problem of climate change seems to be increasingly scientific. You can examples here of trying to block out the sun and stuff like that to cool the planet down, rather than actually changing the kind of norms and structures of the way that we live. So power is a key theme, and we'll look at it through different lenses all the way throughout the course. Okay, I'll finish part 2 there and come back in a second with part 3, discussing the sociological imagination.